So we have here Shai Heredia, Shumona Goel.
Okay. Hi, and thanks to Mark and Adam and Becca from the LA Filmforum and Echo Park Film Center and the Mike Kelly Foundation for bringing us here. It's already been 2 pretty action-packed and exciting days. The screening yesterday was fantastic at the Egyptian. We were really excited to show that film. So this program, Mark did mention that maybe we should show some other works from the Indian avant-garde context. One should say, across this one and the next program, you're really going to only see 8 films. So clearly it's like, there's just this drop in the ocean, really, of work that exists both historically and in the contemporary context. So we've tried to kind of mix some of that. So the first film is a film called Abid by Pramod Pati. Pramod Pati, along with SNS Shastri, who make the film This Bit of That India, were making films at Films Division India, which was essentially the propagandist unit of film of the state from the 60s through the 60s and 70s. There was this community of experimental filmmakers at Films Division, and many years ago, and in the mid-70s, this movement kind of died for various reasons. There was an emergency call by the state, etc., and I think that they found that this work was a bit too subversive and crazy. So with Experimenta, which is a festival that we put together, we started in 2003, we began to dig out some of this work. So you'll see a couple of those films. SNS Shastri's work is also extremely important. We have another film by him in the next program called I'm 20. And then there's a work by Ruchir Joshi, which was made in 1993. This was originally commissioned by Channel 4. And I think Ruchi, what's interesting about the film is that it's all about filmmaking, but it's also about kind of reversing the gaze, because that was a time when you had films like City of Joy, etc., and they're critiquing their representation of Calcutta at the time, which was being quite fetishized. So yeah, so those are the 3 films, and then there's I Am Micro, which Mona will tell you about.
Well, I won't tell you too much about the film because it's a very short film. But Shai and I have been making films and working together in some capacity or the other for almost 20 years. And I think that we were thinking about what to say about the film, and we felt we fight so much that we thought maybe we should just say that working together is very much about a very deep friendship. And in the Indian avant-garde context, unfortunately, we were talking to Mark yesterday about how it's very difficult actually for women to make films sometimes. So we are each other's infrastructure. And I think that when you see the film, you'll see it's very emotional as a film. So.
Okay, so enjoy.
I have to say, I've admired your films. I haven't seen them over the past several years, but this was a really brilliant bit of programming, I thought. I mean, in 4 films, you created like a whole narrative, I feel. I mean, there's this sort of like effervescence and optimism of the first film, and then it passes through. And I also felt like the program itself is almost about the condition of being an artist, one who's searching or trying to establish a certain sense of freedom and independence, but also self-definition. And I felt like this thread was kind of running through all the films. And you have this kind of dark statement at the end. And I love also in This Bit of That India, you have this incredible contrast of all these very active, busy, lively spaces. And then in your film, at the very end, you have this kind of desolate environment. And I mean, I know the creation of the program was quite involved and everything. I mean, there's so many possibilities. But yeah, am I totally off? Or
no, you're like, I think it's a really great reading. But I think we fought a lot and we did a lot of like talking back and forth, and I think we just kind of in some ways wanted to stay true to some of the things that we were interested in exploring, like even with like I Am Micro, keeping, let's say, I Am Micro at the core. There's also this stuff around looking at socialist India and the shift of that, and us as artists who kind of existed or grew up in a particular context. having a particular relationship to film and where we're at today. So yeah, so the films division stuff kind of is an homage to that, and then and I guess we should say that I Am Micro was shot in a factory called National Instruments Limited, which is in Calcutta. It was one of the first factories to make film still cameras.
Yeah, it was the first indigenous still camera from India.
And the last image that you see is this bizarre image, which when you walk. Anyway, so the point is that the factory was declared a sick factory in the 80s, and we shot this in 2010, and it was left exactly as it was then. So it was literally like, you know, the workers literally just got up and left, and it was exactly, you know, the same. And yeah, I was going to say something else. Yeah, so anyway, so when we walked into this space, and this image that you see at the end was the camera that they were making called National 35, which was going to be their first like Instamatic camera, and that was this model that they used to take it to like symposiums and traveling shows and stuff. It was just there as you entered, this kind of like dead piece. But I think
But NIL was also a very important optics lab in general during the colonial time for many countries nearby also.
Yeah.
So it was a very significant lab at one time.
Can I ask a
Sure.
question? I mean, it's so, just pursuant directly to that image, you look at it and you think, I'm so glad you're both here. It's amazing that you're here. I mean, at this moment in time is really, it's an interesting moment for you to be here sharing this. The camera is too big for the table, or the table is made tiny so that it could make the camera look, you know, as though it were small. I mean, so large, right? You can't tell if it's a dollhouse image or not, the way that it's framed. And there's a metaphor, a visual metaphor implied in that image that you say for the end. And I somehow feel that it circles back into your thesis for this entire program that you shared with us, is that there is a metaphorical quality of the image that runs through the entire thing, and we can take with it what we want or what we're able to. And I just wanted to thank you for that.
I'm really curious about audience, actually, with these films, especially because, as you mentioned, the films division films were essentially propaganda films.
Yeah.
But were they propaganda films for Indians in India?
Yeah.
Or, okay.
So the cool thing about these films was that they would travel around the country to like thousands of theaters. So you just have this stuff that would be thrown at you before the feature film, you know. So all this, like, also the crazy work and the more like straightforward propagandist work would be traveling across the country. So there were audiences maybe by force, but Shastri's films and Pati's films have traveled to festivals like back in the day to Oberhausen, and also, I mean, a lot of them trained because we were basically connected to like the Soviet corridor essentially, so a lot of them used to train in Eastern Europe and Czechoslovakia and stuff like that. With the other stuff, I mean, like...
Well, I mean, I think also these particular films, Pati and Shastri's films, are obviously oddities. The whole system of film production was that there was a film school, the Film and Television Institute of India, and you would go and learn how to make films. Then you could go to films division to produce the films, and then you would go to production to broadcast the films. And was there any other circuits?
No,
so it was a very like proper socialist setup for how to have a film
run by the state
culture, which was state run. And then there was one period in films division where there was a particular director.
There's John Bhavnagari. Yeah, so there was this period in the 60s and 70s where he was kind of facilitating this practice. Essentially what was happening also was, you know, it was this kind of agitprop thing. They would travel across the country and shoot a bunch of footage and then bring it back in and then work with it and then make some kind of straightforward stuff and some, you know, more experimental stuff. There was also, it was an extended community. It was really interesting because there was so Abid in the first film is an artist by the name of Abid Surti, who's still alive. Abid Surti was made one of the first Indian comic book heroes called Bahadur, and I did an interview with him a long time ago. So he was an artist himself, and he was by day working with like the newspaper, with like Times of India, and he got laid off, and he was really like depressed, and he was at home. And Pati and all these guys used to hang out, and Pramod Pati went to his space and saw that basically Abid had kind of ended up painting his entire house because he was just in this funk basically. He had no work, etc. And then they took that idea and then made the film. And apparently when they were making the film, they shot it over 2 weeks at the Film Division Studios. Satyajit Ray dropped in, and you had like B.R. Chopra from like the film industry. Everybody was like, what is going on there? So I mean it was, and then I should also say that Pandit Vijay Raghav Rao, who did the sound on Abid and who's did a lot of the sound for a lot of these films, was a classical musician, and he got into this whole aesthetic with them. But yeah, and what else was there? I mean, and then with audiences for like, let's say, newer stuff, I think now stuff gets shown. So we started Experimenta in 2003, and I think Experimenta was in some way significant to kind of validate a particular practice.
Which is, you should say briefly, that's the festival.
That's the Experimental Film Festival that from since 2003 I've been running, and the thing, and so I think that so I think that, and what we do a lot is primarily is juxtapose this historical and contemporary stuff and international historical and contemporary stuff. So I don't go into this thing of representing India through the festival, but it's more about kind of facilitating the context of this work. Yeah.
When you made I Am Micro, oh sorry.
No, I was just going to add that I think that, no, that's okay, I'll bring it up later. Yeah.
The reason I asked about audience is also, I was thinking about to whom these films were directed in a way. And something like Tales from Planet Kolkata, which is a totally amazing movie. I was wondering, did Ruchir have a sense of the likely audience predominantly who would see that? And also, in a way, the same question for you, because obviously Micro is shown in quite a few festivals internationally. And the reason I'm interested in this is to what degree you're including context for a non-Indian audience or not, depending on the subject matter and some of the themes that you're exploring.
Are you asking about our practice or
But as well as some Tales from Planet Kolkata, if you know.
I mean, I think, I'm assuming, I don't want to speak on behalf of Ruchir, but I mean, it was a Channel 4 commission, and Channel 4 at that time was doing really interesting work. So I'm assuming he knew that was his audience. And actually, this film hasn't shown very much in India. I mean, there's the odd screening, and obviously over the years, but not many people know it.
Yeah, actually, no? I don't think there are any other platforms where any of these films would be shown other than at Experimenta. And actually, it's interesting how Experimenta formed was that we had a friend who brought back a huge collection of VHS tapes that he had copied in film school in America. And so a small group of our friends, we just watched all these films again and again and again. And then finally Shai was like, we have run out of the films, and the internet had really not kicked in then. So she said, if I start a festival, people will have to send us films. So, the audience thing was always very kind of
it was
niche,
it was
small,
for
fragmented,
friends, really.
And it was really for your friends, actually.
Yeah.
We all were communicating with each other all over the country, different parts of the country. There would be one festival director in Kerala who would be supportive, or there'd be one filmmaker in the institute in Pune who would be interested. So it was a very fragmented audience and a fragmented community of practitioners. And one of the things that I noticed when we were watching these films is just with what little resources people have made these films. And so a lot of the work actually is fragmented, but also, unlike a lot of other films that I've seen that are in the experimental genre, very much leaning towards a narrative. So it's even with Om Darmadar yesterday, you know, we have a tendency in Indian experimental practices to lean towards some kind of narrative, but at the same time, it's a very fragmented one, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're just going back to this, I mean, like the first year when we did the festival in 2003, we had like 15 films from the Larks, you know, a mix of like, you know, Michael Snow, you know, a bunch of stuff from Europe and America and the UK, and it was literally, I mean, it was one of those things where you're gonna get the British Council and get some prints and got some money and put this thing together, just kind of, and then there were like 400 people over like 3 days, and we were just like, shit, you know, this is a thing. And then we were like, maybe we should do this, you know, and that's kind of how it happened, really. I think for our, I think
the audiences have changed, because actually the 400 people thing I remember, and I even remember before when Oberhausen would bring a package or something, there would be people standing in the projectionist's booth to try to watch these films. So actually there is a really keen audience, a really rigorous audience, but it's just not organized in that way.
Have you seen an influence of the festival on young filmmakers, because it's like a concentrated exposure to work outside of India that you're bringing?
I mean, I would say that the festival has become quite important to the you know, to this.
I realize I'm asking you to compliment
I
yourself.
know. I mean, but the truth is that, I mean, it's interesting to see like a lot of work building. I mean, like from the first year, we put an open call out. I had 30 films, you know, and those were the days with VHS, and like one Indian film. And now, I mean, I have my open call and there's 150, you know, and I'm like, oh, okay, you know. And it's really great. I mean, and people come to watch stuff. So, yeah, so I mean, there's an energy that the festival has, and I do think that it has a lot to do with us as filmmakers who are also programming this and you know, very involved with keeping it going. So yeah, the energy is a particular kind, I think. You know. Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah.
Could you tell us more about the film division? And you know, you've mentioned that in your introduction that at a certain point the government thought that these films weren't functioning as...
Yeah, so basically, so what happened was, so during this period from, let's say, the mid-60s to about 74, 75, there was Jean Bhavanagri, who was the chief producer, who was, you know, an artist himself and also a bureaucrat, and he facilitated this practice of getting a lot of people to make more experimental work, supported it. And this work would go out, and I think that and if you see some of the other stuff, it's all quite subversive. Actually, this is a little more like contained, and I don't think people were really looking, you know, at what was being made, because I really don't think they were. But then what happened in '75 was that there was the emergency declared by Indira Gandhi, who was then the Prime Minister, or whatever. It's a complicated narrative, but she got paranoid, and there was a period of like a year and a half where, you know, they were censoring everything, like, you know, the press, what was made, films division was like fully clamped down on, and at that point they were like, I think realized what was going on, and at which point then Jean Bhavanagri moved on. And then in any case, I think in like the early 70s, there was this seminar where they talked about the films, and there was this discussion about, essentially they thought that the films were a waste of public money, and this whole idea of the documentary being something that's facilitating society, and this is so that kind of came to a head with the emergency, and then that was the end of that. And then they never showed that work, you know, it was just kept in the archive. And it was only in 2004 when I kind of went in there and was like, what is this? And but having said that, I mean, I have to say that compared to the National Film Archives of India, which is like, you know, a shithole, it's just a trauma to deal with. Films division is amazing, because I think at their core, their role was to distribute stuff, was to distribute the films across the country. So now that we've digitized everything and until like 6 years ago, if I was showing some work abroad, they would send the 35 on print, you know. Now, of course, it's all digital, but still, you know, you can access them quite easily, and yeah, so they're quite okay. There's also producing films. They're not the greatest, but still, I mean, they're still facilitating young people making work, all digital. But until, like Shumona was saying, until the 90s, like even for us, if we wanted to make a film, like before the whole like DV digital thing came to India, we would have to pitch to films division and shoot film. 35 of them. So they were the guys who would commission all the films, basically.
There's a bit of like something I noticed like from the themes of the series of films is you guys kind of embrace the like themes of like optics, both from like a scientific and like a political perspective. You know, down to like the Optics Factory, right? And I noticed when it came to Tales from Planet Kolkata, sorry. That was it was coming from like a very like societal, like political sense, or like a kind of like European perspective on India or Calcutta versus like this criticism of that perspective. And then I noticed like coming down to I Micro, that sort of like perspective versus criticism became a personal thing. Right, and so what I'm kind of interested in figuring out is what draws you to that theme of this kind of constant self-criticism of, it seems to me like an ego, whereas like in Calcutta it's like the societal ego, like the English ego, like twisting or distorting reality versus, and it seems to me like in I Micro it's like the filmmaker struggling with his own ego to create something that can affect people or that can exist beyond them.
Well, I think that in I Micro, I think with what resonated for us, I think with Tales from Planet Kolkata was just the idea of problematizing. How do we make images and how do we construct meaning out of those things? And City of Joy was a really traumatic production in Calcutta, I think. And the issues I think in I Am Micro are kind of about the way in which the commercial film industry operates, and as well as how the state financed films. I think at one point the voiceover is also a filmmaker, so he was talking about how all these people who were making films were bureaucrats. You know, they were basically the same filmmakers, got money year after year after year from the state, so it was not accessible to anybody. And then he talks about how times change and it becomes commercial. But you still have this aspiration, you want to make a great, beautiful, radical film. And it's just a really, the process of making that film may not be such a humane process. So I think that was more of the idea that was in that, in I Am Micro.
Yeah.
It was not, I don't know what maybe the ego aspect you were referring to.
Well, for me it was more like the sort of, I guess like they were complementary, or they kind of like harmonized in a certain way, where Calcutta was, it was a broader like societal look at the same kind of phenomenon, where I Am Micro was very personal.
Yeah,
so it sort of like got this big theme and then, you know, condensed it down to like the personal experience of it, especially for a filmmaker. And so I wonder how, with this in mind, how do you approach filmmaking?
I mean, I think for us, film is like the form and how we make the film itself is as essential as the subject matter of what we're making the film about. I think that's something that we...
I think we take a really long time. So like, we take like 4 years maybe to make, you know, a 10-minute piece or a 12-minute piece. We have other lives. But I think that, and therefore what happens, and we're really comfortable with that form of practice, is that our lives find a presence in the film. You know, I don't know. I mean, these are just layers and like and subtext to a lot of what you've seen there, which is actually quite personal in many ways. So yeah, I think we have like ideas. We discuss. We will shoot for these ideas, and then begin to edit and work with them, and then where we're at and the emotional space that we're at kind of
And I think that
builds in an associative sort of way.
I was going to say that I think Shai and I are probably closer in our practice to maybe how you would be. Are you filming?
Yeah.
So because we have always been making personal work. So I think right now we're developing a project which is our first kind of political, societal type of film. But all of our work has always been very kind of sort of personal, intimate things. Except, I mean, tomorrow the film we're going to show of ours is a commissioned film, so that's a different kind of.
I think they're also like made for different. I mean, like I think our film, like we said, was kind of made for us and like our friends in some sense. I think Ruchi's film was made from for a particular audience. So he was clearly talking about the gaze, and he was making like reversing the gaze on the British through this Channel 4 thing. So there was a consciousness that I think was quite different.
And you talk about the soundtrack of your film. It's very wonderful. The music's wonderful. The voices are wonderful. It has a very intimate quality, which is why we might be responding to it as personal. But intimate is different. Intimate is anybody. It's not just you. It's anybody who reacts to that. You talk about that a little bit?
Actually, this film came together in over many years of fragments. So the voiceover started with us thinking that there was a filmmaker who was very close to us as a friend, and he was much elder and didn't have any space actually. He was really a lost kind of soul in some ways. And so we just said, we don't know what will happen to him. So maybe we should start doing some interviews with him, or just document him in some way so that there's some record, because our records are really fragmented. So over, I guess, a year, we were doing audio interviews with this filmmaker, and then over time, we started to shoot some of the footage. So the audio interview, the audio is pieced together sentences.
Yeah.
Sometimes they are the sentence he said, and sometimes there's a phrase and another phrase, and we connected it to make a sentence. And so the audio is very carefully constructed with a biographical interview that we had done over a year or two. And then so that's the main
and then we
aspect
had the
of
film
the
shoot,
voiceover.
and then we had the factory,
Yes,
and what we essentially did was we cut we cut
combined all
picture,
of
but we
these.
cut picture first, and then we brought in the voiceover. I mean, I should tell you the voiceover is of filmmaker Kamal Swaroop, whose film we actually showed yesterday, which was this cult film, and he made this one film, and which never got shown, etc., and then got shown 25 years later, which was like a few years ago. So we were doing this, this kind of portrait thing with Kamal, and
Well, I mean, I think that it should really be said, Shai will say it, that a lot of these films are films that through Shai's research in our archives, she has kind of dug out in a process of trying to understand what could possibly be a language of Indian experimental filmmaking. What is our traditions, what are our traditions or practices. So I think that the fact that Kamal Swaroop, the person whose voiceover is in this, and the film that we showed last night, it had a cinema release after 25 years, is because she went and got that film out of the archive, got it DVDs made and showed it and took it places and talked about it. And now the thing is that Kamal, when we were interviewing him, was like, an alcoholic. I mean, he still is an alcoholic, but the thing is that he's now so prolific. He's making so many films again.
So it's really interesting because he says, this is why I stopped making films. And then now he's been making tons of work, which is great. And I think that actually, even though the impetus of the film started with like the Kamal interview,
It was very
The
fragmented.
film, yeah, I mean, you know, so this idea of it even being a portrait of Kamal was lost at some point. You know, it then became about 50,000 other things for us. So
Then
I
it
think
was
Kamal
also-
became like, his voice is like, yeah.
I mean, that's important to say that his voice was constructed after we had cut a picture together. And the footage, like, I don't know if you can tell, it's of a film shoot that's happening. So that was a separate film of one of our friends who was shooting a very independent film outside of the industry, but speaking to the industry. So there's a lot of layers in our film about the entire Indian film context. So the actual film that we are showing being shot was also by our, like I said, friend who, you know, was making an independent film about film also. So, I mean, we are also from Bombay in some ways, which is a kind of like LA, it's the heart of Bollywood. So we are very self-conscious of the filmmaking process, very, very much so.
I mean, the history of the LA Avant-Garde has a thread running through it in dialogue with the industry too. So I think we, of all cities, we understand.
Yeah, exactly. And then the factory footage was just because we got actually Michael through Aditi access to this factory. So we were like, let's just shoot. And then somehow Kamal and that behind the scenes and the factory sort of were speaking to each other.
In the Sastri film, this bit of that India, how common would it have been for somebody in the 70s to have access to those archives of films and just to be mining those archives? They seem very particular pieces. That
Well, it's all shot for the film, I think, right?
was it all? I mean,
I think that
I mean, it's not a found footage film.
There might be
There might
take
be
cuts
some,
that are
yeah, there
I
are
mean, because
pieces.
that happens
Yeah.
a lot with
Clearly.
some of the films division stuff. You see some shots from the other side.
Yeah, clearly there are pieces that are found footage.
No, but it was these guys who were working there. I mean, as a random person, you didn't have access. If you were working in there, then you know you could use that pool of footage. I'm assuming. I should say actually that when they stopped making this work and they kind of shut down this thing, this collective essentially. It was really sad because a lot of these guys, I mean, because they have jobs. It's like a government job. So I have the government job at Film Division India, and I do some paperwork, and I also make films, and I might be like editing, or I might be doing sound, or whatever. So these guys just went back to being these admin guys, you know, and like, you know, a couple of them, like Pramod Pati died quite young. So it was quite sad actually.
There was a love for the medium that existed there within the context that they were in for that brief moment. So, as you see it, thank you.
Oh no, I just wanted to give an appreciation for how intimate your film was in terms of yourselves. I mean, I don't like the word personal. I don't like personal cinema, you know, that word. I think in intimate cinema says something much more. So I appreciate what you said. And so, yeah, it's just that. I think that, I don't know how many hours you interviewed him for. I kind of wonder if he was someone who repeated himself often, the same things over and over again, and you
These
made a
are like,
collage
I mean,
out of that.
It's
It
like
would be
seemed like that to
Kamalisms.
me.
maybe
Yeah.
after 5 interviews, it'd be like, that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, anyway, I appreciated it very much. It
Thank
was
you.
abstract, but also extremely intimate, which is a rare combination.
Any final questions? Well, please come Wednesday night to the Hammer, to the Billy Wilder Theater for a completely different program, including An Old Dog's Diary, the most recent film you guys have completed. And then please join me in thanking Shai and Shumona.